We're in Volterra, which is one of the most attractive of all the Tuscan walled towns. It's amazingly preserved. The town is about 1,000 years old, and the buildings we see today easily date back to the Middle Ages. And the earliest foundations of Volterra go back to the Etruscan days, nearly 3,000 years ago. There was an Etruscan town here, and it was one of the main dozen Etruscan towns in what is today Tuscany. And eventually it was conquered by ancient Rome. That was about 300 BC. And the Romans ruled for that era until about 500 AD. And then comes the Middle Ages, and later occupation by Florence. Back in the Middle Ages and the early Renaissance, 1400s, there was a lot of rivalry between these city-states. And Volterra was actually an autonomous city-state. It has a marvelous wall around it, which is beautifully preserved today. It goes for about 3 miles all around the city, preserving the stone historical gem intact. It's mostly a pedestrian zone when you're in the old town. The residents live in the old town, and they work here. It's a great tourist center, and yet it's a little bit off the beaten track of tourists. You can't get here by train. You can get here by bus, so it's, for example, about a 2-hour bus ride away from Florence. Direct buses, maybe 5 times a day. So it's certainly feasible if you were staying in Florence for a couple of days or in Siena, you can get over to Volterra, and you would really be delighted to see how beautiful this town is. And of course, there's a whole bunch of restaurants, there's pizzerias, snack shops, coffee shops, lots of little stores. One of their specialties here is alabaster. And earlier, they had a lot of alabaster mines, which are actually still in operation today. And shops sell this very fine, thin white stone, alabaster. They make plates out of it, and bowls, and lampshades, little figurines. Earlier in the history of Volterra, a different mineral was important. It was alum. A-L-U-M, alum, and that was used for setting the dye in textiles. That was very important in Florence, which was a great textile center, and one of the reasons why Florence under the Medici wanted to control Volterra, and so they did. They conquered it. Lorenzo the Magnificent sent the Duke of Urbino over here with his troops and massacred some civilians in Volterra and subdued them, and then paid them a little pittance as a reward to keep them in line. And for several hundred years, Florence dominated Volterra. There's a handful of very charming small hotels within the walls of Volterra in the old town. We're staying at one called La Locanda. It's quite nice. And there's 3 or 4 other significant hotels, and then some tiny ones and some bed and breakfast, pensiones. So you can find places to stay. If you're here during the busy season, of course, you want to be sure to make reservations. We're here in the off season. It's November, which is really a lovely time to be traveling in Italy. Temperatures are nice, and there's very few tourists around. Most attractions are open. Some are closed, some restaurants are closed, and attractions do have somewhat limited hours. But November is wonderful to be here. The availability of hotel rooms is no problem. You can get a table in a good restaurant without worrying, and you don't see many crowds. You have the town all to yourself, shared with the locals. Volterra, put that on your map.